Earlier today, we got some pretty massive news around Cyberpunk 2077. That is, that Cyberpunk 2077 is confirmed as getting multiplayer in the future. Cyberpunk 2077 and multiplayer have kind of had this weird relationship. At several points over the past few months, it was talked about pretty verbatim in certain interviews or during certain conferences that, yeah, the game would be getting multiplayer at some point, but then later on there was different statements or conflicting statements that it was more of just an R&D thing, and they're seeing if it makes a fit in the game. But then also things like several years ago, all the way back in 2013, they mentioned the game would have multiplayer, so it really seemed like it is a long-term plan for this game. Well, it seems like today CD Projekt was tired of the back and forth and just decided to outright confirm it. From the official CD Projekt Red Twitter account, they did tweet, "Until now, the only thing we said about multi was that it was in R&D. As we're getting closer to launching single-player Cyberpunk 2077 in April 2020, we'd like to confirm that multiplayer is in the works. If you feel like lending us your skills, apply." The link at the bottom will take you to their job listing page, where you can now find a separate subsection around multiplayer in Cyberpunk 2077. They have a follow-up tweet to this saying, "The plan for now is to deliver Cyberpunk 2077 in April, then follow up with DLCs, which will be free, and single-player content. And then once they're done with all of that, invite you for some multiplayer action." This is without a doubt one of those decisions or announcements that have been met with kind of some mixed reactions. One of the top tweets on this announcement tweet is actually a negative reaction to this, someone not happy that this is coming to the game, but I think there's a few important things to point out around this that might not be immediately obvious. This tweet also seems to reveal some about their DLC plans and schedule. Assuming this remains true, and I'm interpreting this correctly, it seems like in April of 2020, we will get Cyberpunk 2077 in a single-player form, aka meaning that there's no multiplayer component on release or even anytime soon after release. But then, as many games do, immediately after release, they'll do a few free DLCs, probably some smaller stuff similar to what they've done in the past, but then switch over to single-player content, probably in the form of expansion packs. In past interviews, we've heard that they're probably going to go with a similar expansion pack style, like what we saw with The Witcher 3. And then, according to this tweet, only after all of that is done, they'll actually switch over to multiplayer. So if this ends up following the same release schedule as The Witcher 3, which it seems like it should be a pretty similar one. Roughly 1 year after release, The Witcher 3 got its final major expansion, and then hypothetically in the case of Cyberpunk, maybe a little over 1 year after release, we'll see the release of multiplayer. That's just pure speculation. We obviously don't know the concrete release schedules for this new game, but it does give you an idea of how this would have played out if they would have done it with the previous game. One of the big complaints, or really where the pushback around multiplayer comes from, is in the form of opportunity cost. A lot of people are worried that as a result of working on multiplayer, they're losing out on other single-player features, or that single-player focus that they thought this game was all about. So although, yes, that argument without a doubt can be made, one thing to point out is they're actually developing multiplayer at one of their separate studios. CD Projekt Red, although being one developer, does have several separate locations and different studios working on different things. This studio, by which the name I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, is the one actually working on multiplayer, separate from the other studios working on the single-player aspects of this game. One thing I actually question around this announcement is if this timeline does hold true. Every time multiplayer is mentioned around this game, I think CD Projekt are almost going a PR route of trying to reinforce the single-player focus despite having multiplayer, which is pretty understandable. You want to minimize fan backlash, but considering we heard talks of multiplayer being a work in progress almost a full year even before the initial release of the game, it would seem kind of crazy if it's still only going to be the last release as far as DLC goes, after all of the other content. In reality, what I could see happening is the game releases, maybe we get the first expansion pack or the first taste of DLC, and then if everything is going accordingly or the climate is appropriate, then they could release multiplayer. Maybe not at the end after everything else. But with that in mind, what could this multiplayer actually look like? A lot of people are wishing for a co-op approach to this. You get the same game of Cyberpunk 2077, but now you could play it with a few other friends. That would be cool, but I don't think that's the route they're going to go, and I don't think many other people do either. With the similarities that are immediately obvious between Cyberpunk and Grand Theft Auto, I have to imagine they're shooting for a GTA Online-esque mode. Grand Theft Auto Online has proved massively successful for Rockstar. So much so that they've pretty much abandoned all single-player DLC and most single-player monetization strategies. You can make a lot of money off a good multiplayer mode on your game, and it definitely can extend the lifetime of your game. I would say the main asset they would have going to multiplayer is the city itself. They crafted this beautiful location, they want to use that and use it pretty fully. And I would say something similar to an open world online mode is the version of that makes the most sense. Maybe you can continue to progress through the main story through this, that obviously would be pretty cool. That'd be kind of almost taking the Fallout 76 approach, except having a separate single player and multiplayer mode. But either way, I'm actually pretty excited for this. I think this multiplayer mode is going to be one of those things that's an attempt to really extend the life of this game. If it really does come out all the way at the end after all of the other DLC, you'll probably have completed a lot of the other stuff, and as you're looking for something new, now you can try this, and maybe you'll get periodic updates, or you could just mess around with some friends. I know a lot of people are unhappy about it, but I for one am actually kind of excited to see what they do with this. CD Projekt has created a lot of cool stuff already. If there's one company I trust adding multiplayer to their game, it's this one. Either way, right now we still don't know a lot. What exactly this mode will look like? Is it the hypothetical GTA Online alternative that I am speculating about, or something encompassing Night City? Could it alternatively just be a couple of PvP arenas placed around the map, building off some of those existing themes in the game with gang warfare, or one faction pitting itself against another? Or maybe it just is co-op. I personally think that even though if co-op gets shipped with this update, it won't be the main focus because it doesn't open up a ton of opportunities. It definitely is really cool, it'd be an amazing addition, but I don't think it has the same staying power as some of the other options. Two of the things that we do know that can get us hopeful about the future is, one, we know Cyberpunk 2077 won't have microtransactions. You have to assume this will also apply to the multiplayer mode, considering it's just building off of the base game. If it doesn't, there will definitely be backlash and outrage around that if this is another microtransaction filled mode, but otherwise, as of right now, I feel pretty confident saying that it won't have that kind of monetization model. But also, we know back in 2017, CD Projekt Red actually accepted a grant to create seamless multiplayer in one of their games. Seamless multiplayer being defined as comprehensive technology enabling the creation of a unique multiplayer experience, including matchmaking and session management, object replication, and support for various gameplay modes together with a custom toolkit. That doesn't really confirm one thing or the other, it is still pretty vague and describes many multiplayer modes that are potentially available, but hey, over time we'll find out more. But I wouldn't be surprised if this multiplayer thing is kind of kept quiet until after game release and we don't hear too many more details around it, although expect it to be a very common question in interviews going forward. Outside of the major announcement in the form of multiplayer, there are a few other things to come out over the past few days. Another decision that was met with some pushback was around first-person perspective in this game. It was recently revealed that Cyberpunk 2077 would be 100% first-person. I say it with quotes because although they say that, it's not technically true. Even in the Fallout tweet, they do mention how during certain driving sequences, as we saw in the most recent gameplay, and in certain cutscenes, there actually will be a third-person perspective, but large in part, it will only be first-person. And they cite really doing this for immersion reasons. Following this news going live also, there was some fan pushback. A lot of people citing, well, now what's the point of customizing your character, changing the appearance of them if you're rarely, if ever, going to see them? There still are certain instances where you will see yourself, such as mirrors. One example thrown around was that Ripperdoc scene where he actually takes out the eye and puts it in your body. You of course see yourself pretty clearly there, but this is one of those mechanics and features that I think it's really hard to understand on paper. We have to see the game, see prolonged gameplay, going through several cutscenes, the examples of when we see ourselves and how often that occurs before we get a good idea of how much of an effect this will actually have. If you're someone that really does enjoy customizing your character, and that was a main selling point, this could be a big issue for you. But for at least me personally, I don't really understand this whole backlash or controversy. I'm not buying this game to have cool outfits on my character and to get to see them. I'm buying it for the RPG elements, the story, the really cool and interesting world they've created here. Although I do understand people's concerns, it certainly feels like one of those things that we have a very limited understanding of, which I would say is partly on the fault of CD Projekt, and that people are kind of blowing a little bit out of proportion. It seems like one of those things that once the game comes out won't even be a major complaint because everyone will have forgotten about that being a thing, but reading it on paper, everyone's super concerned that it's going to be game breaking. That's the bulk of the news that I wanted to go over and talk about in this video. Outside of that, we actually did see that the CD Projekt Red store is now shipping to the EU, Canada, and USA, which is actually pretty big. They weren't shipping to the US before, and a lot of people weren't too happy about that. And we also got to see some new renders from certain characters or NPCs from within the game as more reference images images for the cosplay contest, but they look pretty cool. As always, again, I thank you all for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this down below in the comments, but with that, I hope to see you guys all next time.